The accusation. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied by spectators, journalists, and even a few curious passers-by who had heard about the unusual case. At the defendant's table sat Michael Carter, a homeless veteran with a weathered face that carried the weight of countless untold stories. His unkempt hair and threadbare jacket stood in stark contrast to the sleek suits of the attorneys and the polished wood of the courtroom. The prosecutor, a young man with sharp features and a voice like a whip, stood confidently. "Your Honor," he began, gesturing towards Michael without even looking at him. "This man is accused of unlawfully trespassing on private property. He was found camping on land owned by the prestigious Mercer Development Corporation. His actions were not only illegal but disruptive to the progress of a major urban project that promises jobs and housing for our community." Michael sat silently, his hands clasped together on the table. His lawyer, a public defender named Emma Hayes, leaned toward him. "Are you ready to speak when the time comes?" she asked in a low voice. Michael nodded, his gaze steady but distant. "I'm ready. They need to know the truth." When the judge, an older man with a stern demeanor and a reputation for being fair but tough, asked if Michael had anything to say in his defense, the room fell silent. Michael stood, his shoulders squared despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Your Honor," he began, his voice gravelly but clear, "before you pass judgment, there's something you need to know. The land I'm accused of trespassing on, it belongs to me." A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Whispers erupted, and the judge's gavel pounded for order. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his tone skeptical, "are you claiming ownership of the property in question? Do you have proof?" Michael hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges of the defendant's table. "I have proof, Your Honor, but it's not with me. It's a long story, but if you allow me, I'll explain." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Michael. "Proceed." Michael took a deep breath and began. "I wasn't always homeless. I served my country for 10 years. After returning, I used my savings and a loan to buy a small plot of land on the outskirts of the city. It was my dream to build a life there, to create a haven where I could heal from the scars of war. But life had other plans." He paused, his voice growing softer. "After the 2008 financial crisis, everything fell apart. I lost my job, my home, and eventually my ability to keep up with the taxes on the land. I thought I'd lost it forever. But recently, I discovered something troubling. The records showing I abandoned the property aren't complete. I believe my land was taken from me unjustly, and I've been trying to prove it ever since." The prosecutor interrupted. "Your Honor, this narrative, while compelling, is irrelevant without tangible evidence. This man is simply trying to delay justice." The judge held up a hand to silence him. "Mr. Carter, do you have any evidence or witnesses to corroborate your claim?" Michael met the judge's gaze. "Not here, but I can find them. I need time." The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "You have 1 week to produce evidence or witnesses, Mr. Carter. Until then, the court remains skeptical of your claim. Bail is set at $500, which I understand you cannot pay. You will remain in custody." As Michael was led away, the whispers in the gallery grew louder. Some dismissed him as a liar, while others saw a man fighting against a system designed to grind people like him into dust. A friend from the past. The news of Michael's case spread quickly, drawing attention from local veterans groups and activists. Among those who heard the story was a man named David Miller, an old Army buddy of Michael's. David, now a community organizer, had spent years helping struggling veterans and knew Michael's integrity firsthand. David visited Michael in jail the next day. "Mike," he said, gripping his friend's shoulder through the bars, "I heard about what's happening. Why didn't you reach out to me?" Michael shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I didn't want to drag you into my mess." David shook his head. "You're not dragging me into anything. You fought for this country, and now it's time for someone to fight for you." Together, they began piecing together the story of the land. Michael remembered an old deed stored in a box he had left with a friend years ago. The problem was, he had lost contact with that friend long ago. David promised to help track them down. A trail of clues. Over the next few days, David and Emma worked tirelessly to gather evidence. They combed through county records, looking for irregularities in the way the land had been seized and sold. What they found was troubling. Several properties, all previously owned by struggling individuals, had been acquired by Mercer Development Corporation under suspicious circumstances. "Looks like they've been targeting people who couldn't fight back," David said, showing Emma the documents. Emma nodded. "If we can prove a pattern, we might have a case for fraud. But we'll need something concrete." The breakthrough came when David tracked down Michael's old friend, an elderly man named Ben Thompson. Ben still had the box Michael had left with him, and inside was the original deed to the land, along with photographs of Michael working on the property years ago. Building the case. Armed with the new evidence, Emma prepared for the next court session. But they knew Mercer Development wouldn't go down without a fight. The corporation had deep pockets and an army of lawyers ready to discredit Michael and his claims. As the hearing approached, the pressure mounted. Michael, though tired and anxious, found strength in the support of David, Emma, and the growing number of people rallying behind him. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. The search for truth. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Michael Carter sat beside his lawyer, Emma Hayes. Despite his exhaustion, his posture was upright, his resolve firm. Today would mark the first real step in proving his claim. The judge entered, and the room fell silent, the tension palpable. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the defendant, "you've had a week to provide evidence supporting your claim of ownership. Have you made progress?" Michael nodded and stood, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of desperation. "Yes, Your Honor. With the help of my lawyer and a friend, we've uncovered evidence that challenges the legitimacy of the land seizure and sale. I believe it proves my ownership and raises questions about Mercer Development's practices." The prosecutor, a smug figure in a pristine gray suit, leaned forward, a glint of mockery in his eyes. "Your Honor, before the defendant continues, I must remind the court that emotional appeals do not substitute for concrete evidence. We await something tangible." Emma rose to her feet. "Your Honor, we have brought documents that include the original deed to the land, photographs from when Mr. Carter owned it, and additional records that suggest misconduct in the property's auction." The judge gestured for her to proceed. Emma approached the bench with a carefully compiled file and handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The room was so quiet that the sound of paper rustling was audible as the judge flipped through the contents. His expression remained neutral, though his eyebrows furrowed slightly as he examined the documents. "These photographs do show Mr. Carter on the land," the judge said after a moment, "and this deed appears to be legitimate. However, there's a gap in the timeline. Mr. Carter, how do you explain the years of inactivity on the property?" Michael took a deep breath. "Your Honor, after the financial crisis, I lost everything. I tried to keep up with the property taxes, but without a home or stable income, it became impossible. I reached out to the county several times, asking for extensions and explaining my situation, but I received no response. When I finally returned to the land, it was already being developed. I didn't even know it had been sold." The prosecutor stood, his voice laced with condescension. "Your Honor, what we have here is a tragic but common story. The defendant failed to meet his obligations, and as a result, the property was lawfully auctioned. Mercer Development followed all legal protocols to acquire the land. This case is nothing more than an attempt to stir public sympathy." Emma interjected. "Your Honor, we have evidence that suggests otherwise. The auction process was expedited in a way that violated standard procedures. In addition, We believe Mercer Development has engaged in a pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals like Mr. Carter to acquire land at unfairly low prices. The judge raised a hand. Enough. This court will review all submitted evidence thoroughly. For now, we'll adjourn until tomorrow. Unearthing corruption. As Michael left the courthouse with Emma and David, they were approached by a small crowd of supporters. Among them were veterans, homeless advocates, and even strangers who had read about his plight. A young woman handed him a folded note, whispering, "They're watching you. Be careful." Michael stared at her as she disappeared into the crowd. "Who's watching?" he asked David. "Mercer Development," David replied grimly. "This fight is bigger than we thought." Later that evening, Michael, Emma, and David met in a cramped office where they spread out their findings on a table. Among the papers was a report from Joe Travers, a private investigator who had been looking into Mercer Development's activities. Joe, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, pointed to a document. "This is where it gets interesting. See this timeline. Mercer Development acquired 5 other properties in the same way they got yours. Fast-tracked auctions where the owners were homeless, deceased, or otherwise unable to fight back." Emma frowned. "And the county allowed this?" Joe smirked. "Allowed? They might have been encouraged. There's evidence that Mercer greased a few palms to push these sales through." Michael leaned forward, anger flickering in his eyes. "You're saying this wasn't just bad luck? They targeted me?" Joe nodded. "It's a pattern, and they've made millions flipping these properties into luxury developments. But if we can prove collusion between Mercer and county officials, we've got a case." The first threat. As the group planned their next move, the sense of unease grew. Michael noticed a black SUV parked outside the office, its windows tinted. The vehicle had appeared near the courthouse and the shelter he stayed at, and now it was here. "Think they're watching us?" Michael asked Joe. Joe shrugged. "Wouldn't be surprised. They've got a lot to lose." That night, as Michael returned to the shelter, he found his belongings rifled through. A note lay atop his tattered duffel bag, scrawled in red ink, "Walk away, or this gets worse." Michael showed the note to Emma the next day. She folded it carefully, her expression hard. "This is intimidation. We need to report it." Michael shook his head. "They'll just deny it. We need to hit them where it hurts, with the truth." Building the case. Over the next few days, the team worked tirelessly. Emma filed a motion to subpoena Mercer Development's internal documents, a risky move that could backfire if they didn't find anything incriminating. Joe continued digging into the company's dealings, uncovering more evidence of shady practices. Meanwhile, David reached out to the media, ensuring Michael's story gained public support. The tension came to a head when Emma received a call from the court clerk. "The judge approved your motion," the clerk said. "Mercer Development has been ordered to provide their records." Emma relayed the news to Michael, who felt a flicker of hope, but their victory was short-lived. The following day, the team arrived at Joe's office to find it ransacked. Papers were strewn everywhere, and Joe's computer had been smashed. "They're desperate," Joe said, surveying the damage. "But this only proves we're onto something. A new ally." As the team regrouped, an unexpected visitor arrived. A whistleblower from inside Mercer Development. The woman, a former employee named Rachel Simmons, claimed to have information that could expose the company's illegal activities. "They've been hiding everything," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Bribing officials, falsifying records, even threatening people who stand in their way. I couldn't stay silent anymore." Rachel handed over a flash drive containing emails, contracts, and other documents that detailed Mercer's corruption. It was the break the team had been waiting for. A turning point. The next day in court, Emma presented the whistleblower's testimony and the flash drive as evidence. The prosecutor objected, calling Rachel's claims unreliable, but the judge allowed the evidence to stand. As the courtroom watched the damning emails projected on a screen, the tide began to turn. Mercer Development's lawyers looked visibly shaken, and murmurs rippled through the audience. For Michael, the moment was bittersweet. He had fought for years to be heard, and now the truth was finally coming to light. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Mercer would throw everything they had into discrediting him and his allies. As the judge adjourned the session, Michael stepped outside into the sunlight. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt the weight of hope pressing against his chest. The whistleblower's secrets. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Rachel Simmons, the whistleblower from Mercer Development, took the stand. Dressed in a modest blazer and clutching a notebook, she exuded nervous energy. Her eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone to drag her out at any moment. Michael watched from the defendant's table, his fists clenched as he willed her to stay strong. The prosecutor, attempting to discredit Rachel, stood with a smirk. "Miss Simmons, let's get one thing clear. You were an employee of Mercer Development, correct?" "Yes," Rachel replied, her voice steady but low. "And yet you're here today to accuse them of misconduct. Isn't it true you were terminated from your position and hold a grudge against the company?" Rachel's lips tightened. "I wasn't terminated. I resigned because I couldn't continue being part of their unethical practices." The prosecutor leaned forward, his tone patronizing. "Unethical practices? That's quite the accusation. Could you provide an example for the court?" Rachel nodded, her grip tightening on the notebook. Mercer Development systematically targeted vulnerable property owners. People like Mr. Carter. They used loopholes, bribery, and intimidation to acquire properties at rock-bottom prices, knowing the owners couldn't fight back. Then they flipped those properties for massive profits. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim. Do you have any evidence to support it?" Rachel took a deep breath, opened her notebook, and pulled out a USB drive. "Yes, I have emails, internal documents, and transaction records that show exactly how they operated." The judge gestured for the evidence to be submitted. The courtroom grew silent as the files were displayed on a large screen. Emails between Mercer executives revealed conversations about expediting auctions and leveraging county contacts. One particularly damning email read, "Ensure Carter's property gets flagged for auction ASAP. He's homeless. He won't contest it." The gallery erupted into murmurs. The prosecutor's smirk disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. A fragile alliance. As court recessed for the day, Michael and his team gathered outside the courthouse. Rachel joined them, visibly shaken. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted, her hands trembling. "They've already tried to scare me off." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "What you're doing takes courage. You've given us a fighting chance." Rachel nodded, though the fear in her eyes remained. Emma stepped in. "We'll ensure you're protected. I'll file for a witness protection order." "They won't touch you," David chimed in. "And you're not alone in this. We've got your back." Rachel managed a small smile, but Michael knew the weight of her decision was heavy. Betraying a company as powerful as Mercer Development came with risks, and Rachel had placed her life on the line to help. The depths of corruption. Over the next few days, the team delved deeper into the files Rachel had provided. Joe, the investigator, worked tirelessly to connect the dots, uncovering a sprawling network of corruption that went beyond Mercer Development. "Look at this," Joe said, pointing to a spreadsheet. "These payments here, bribes to county officials. They didn't just bend the rules. They broke them wide open." Emma studied the files, her expression dark. "This could be the smoking gun we need. If we can prove Mercer's actions weren't just unethical but illegal, we'll have a real shot at overturning the auction." But as they pieced together the evidence, the pressure mounted. The black SUV that had been tailing Michael now appeared outside Rachel's apartment. David reported strange calls to his phone, and Emma's office was broken into, though nothing was stolen. "They're trying to rattle us," Joe said, his tone grim. "It means we're getting close." The media storm. As the case gained traction, the media frenzy surrounding Michael's story grew. Journalists camped outside the courthouse, eager for updates. News outlets ran headlines like, "Veterans Fight Against Corporate Greed," and "Homeless Hero Takes on Mercer Development." The increased attention brought both support and scrutiny. Donations poured in from people moved by Michael's story, while detractors accused him of exploiting public sympathy. Michael tried to focus on the positives: the letters from fellow veterans, the meals brought to the shelter by strangers, the signs of solidarity held by protesters outside the courthouse. But the spotlight also painted a target on his back. One night, as Michael returned to the shelter, he found a message spray-painted across the wall: "Back off or else." An unexpected betrayal. The next morning, as the team prepared for court, Joe walked in with a grim expression. "We've got a problem," he said, tossing a folder onto the table. Emma opened it, her face paling as she read. "This can't be right." "What is it?" Michael asked, his stomach tightening. Joe sighed. "Rachel's credibility is under attack. Mercer's lawyers claim she falsified some of the documents she submitted." Michael frowned. "That's impossible. She gave us the files directly from their system." Emma nodded. "It's a classic smear tactic, but it'll cast doubt on everything she's testified to." The courtroom was electric as Mercer's lawyers presented their counterattack. They introduced a former colleague of Rachel's, a man named Thomas Reed, who claimed Rachel had a history of fabricating evidence for personal gain. "She's lying," Rachel whispered to Emma as they watched Thomas testify. "He's the one who covered up Mercer's dirty deals." Emma squeezed her hand. "We'll expose him. Just hold on." The truth emerges. During cross-examination, Emma tore into Thomas's testimony. "Mr. Reed, you worked closely with Rachel Simmons, correct?" "Yes," Thomas replied, his confidence wavering. "And you were aware of Mercer Development's practices?" Thomas hesitated. I was just following orders." Emma leaned closer. "Orders to falsify records and intimidate property owners." The gallery murmured as Thomas squirmed. Emma pressed on. "Isn't it true that you were paid by Mercer to discredit Rachel? How much did they offer you to lie under oath?" Thomas's face flushed. I don't know what you're talking about." Emma stepped back, a triumphant smile on her lips. No further questions. The prosecutor attempted to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. Rachel's credibility remained intact, and Thomas's shaky testimony only strengthened Michael's case. The turning point. As the trial neared its conclusion, Emma presented her closing argument. "This case isn't just about one man's fight for justice. It's about holding corporations accountable for exploiting the vulnerable. Michael Carter is a symbol of resilience and courage, but he shouldn't have to stand alone. It's time for the truth to prevail." The courtroom erupted in applause, the sound of hope reverberating through the halls. The fight was far from over, but Michael and his team had turned the tide. Mercer Development had been exposed, and for the first time, Michael felt the weight of possibility. A chance to reclaim his land and restore his dignity. The price of justice. The courtroom was abuzz with tension as Michael Carter's case entered its most critical phase. Mercer Development's reputation had taken a severe hit after Emma's dismantling of their witness, Thomas Reed. Still, the corporation was a titan unwilling to fall without a fight. Behind closed doors, Michael's team regrouped, knowing the stakes had never been higher. Emma sat at the head of the table in their rented office, sifting through a mountain of evidence. Michael, David, Rachel, and Joe surrounded her, their faces etched with exhaustion, but brimming with determination. "We've got momentum," Emma said, her voice steady despite the weight of the task ahead. "But Mercer isn't out of tricks. They're going to play dirty, and they'll try to discredit every single piece of evidence we present." Joe, the seasoned investigator, nodded grimly. "They've already been trying to intimidate us. The SUV, the break-ins, the threats, they're desperate. We've rattled them, but we can't get cocky." Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "What's our next move?" Emma looked at Rachel. "We need you to testify again. This time, we're focusing on the internal communications you brought us. Those emails are the nail in Mercer's coffin, but we need you to explain them in detail." Rachel hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "What if they come after me again? What if they—" Michael interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "Rachel, you've already done the hardest part. You stood up when it mattered most. We'll make sure you're protected. You're not alone in this." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Okay, I'll do it." The return to the stand. The next morning, Rachel returned to the witness stand. The courtroom was packed, with spectators spilling into the hallway. The media had dubbed the case Carter versus the Giant, and the public was hungry for updates. Outside, protesters chanted slogans against corporate greed, their signs visible through the courtroom windows. Emma approached the stand, her voice calm and measured. "Miss Simmons, could you describe the significance of the emails you provided to the court?" Rachel nodded, her voice steady despite the scrutiny. "These emails show that Mercer executives knew the auctions were rigged. They specifically targeted properties like Mr. Carter's, where the owners couldn't fight back. They expedited the process to avoid legal challenges and bribed county officials to keep it quiet." Emma handed Rachel a document. "Can you read this email aloud for the court?" Rachel adjusted her glasses and began. "Ensure Carter's property is flagged as abandoned within 6 months. Expedite auction protocols. We can't afford delays." The room buzzed with murmurs, and the judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Emma turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this email is just one of many that proves Mercer Development's deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals. They didn't just follow the law, they manipulated it to suit their agenda." Mercer strikes back. As expected, Mercer's legal team wasted no time launching their counterattack. The lead attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Victoria Hargrove, stood and began her cross-examination. "Miss Simmons," Victoria began, her voice dripping with disdain, "you've painted a picture of a company engaging in widespread corruption. Yet you were a part of this organization for years. Why did you only come forward now?" Rachel squared her shoulders. "Because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. I saw what they were doing, and I knew it was wrong." Victoria smirked. "How convenient. Isn't it true that you were passed over for a promotion shortly before you resigned? Could your testimony be motivated by bitterness?" Rachel's face reddened, but she kept her composure. "No, I'm here because it's the right thing to do." Victoria pounced. "And yet, the evidence you've provided could have been fabricated. Isn't it possible you altered these emails to incriminate Mercer?" Emma immediately objected. "Your Honor, the defense is engaging in baseless speculation." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Miss Hargrove, stick to the evidence." Uncovering a hidden agenda. During a recess, Joe approached Emma with a file he had been working on. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. Emma frowned. "What now?" Joe laid the file on the table. "I've been digging into the county officials involved in the auction process. Turns out, one of them, Edward Grayson, has ties to Mercer. He's received consulting fees from them for years." Emma's eyes widened. "This is huge. If we can prove Grayson was on their payroll, it could invalidate the entire auction." Michael, listening intently, leaned forward. "How do we prove it?" Joe grinned. "Already working on it. I've got a contact at the county clerk's office who might be able to give us access to Grayson's financial records. It's risky, but if we pull it off, it'll be worth it." A dangerous revelation. That evening, as Michael walked back to the shelter, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The black SUV appeared again, this time idling near the corner of the street. Michael's instincts, honed from years in the military, told him something was wrong. As he approached the shelter, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man in a dark suit, his face obscured by a baseball cap. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice calm but menacing, "we need to talk." Michael stopped, his fists clenched. If you're here to threaten me, save your breath." The man chuckled. "This isn't a threat. It's an offer. Walk away from this case, and you'll never have to worry about money again." Michael's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't?" The man's smile faded. "Then you'll wish you had." Michael stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Tell your bosses I'm not for sale. If they want to scare me, they'll have to try harder." The evidence emerges. The next day, Joe arrived at the office with a triumphant smile. "We've got it," he said, holding up a USB drive. Grayson's financial records showed direct payments from Mercer, disguised as consulting fees. Emma's eyes lit up. "This is it. This ties Mercer directly to the corruption." They quickly prepared to present the evidence in court. The judge, visibly intrigued by the mounting revelations, allowed the records to be admitted. Emma walked the court through the transactions, painting a damning picture of Mercer's practices. "This isn't just about one property," Emma concluded. "This is about a corporation systematically exploiting the vulnerable. They targeted Michael Carter because they thought he couldn't fight back. They were wrong. The fight isn't over." As the trial neared its conclusion, Michael felt a mix of hope and exhaustion. The evidence was damning, and public opinion was firmly on his side. But he knew Mercer wouldn't give up easily. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters had grown. Veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, their chants echoing through the streets. Michael stepped to the edge of the steps, raising a hand in acknowledgement. "This isn't just my fight," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is for everyone who's been pushed aside, ignored, and taken advantage of. Together, we can make a difference." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy fueling Michael's resolve. But as he turned back toward the courthouse, his thoughts darkened. The fight wasn't over. Mercer still had resources, influence, and a willingness to play dirty. Michael knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, and he wouldn't let it go. The Empire Strikes Back. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the case approached its climax. Journalists and supporters filled every seat, while protesters gathered outside, chanting against corporate greed. Michael Carter's journey had captured the nation's attention, and Mercer Development was desperate to regain control of the narrative. The tension in the air was palpable. Emma Hayes, Michael's tireless lawyer, stood at the defense table, preparing for what she knew would be the most challenging day yet. Mercer Development's legal team had introduced a last-minute motion, accusing Michael and his team of tampering with evidence. The allegation. Victoria Hargrove, Mercer's lead attorney, strode to the center of the courtroom, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor," she began, her voice slicing through the murmurs. "The defense has built its case on shaky evidence and emotional appeals. But today we present proof that the emails and financial records provided by the defense have been altered to paint Mercer Development in a false light." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Michael's heart sank as Victoria held up a document. "This," she continued, "is an analysis from a forensic expert showing discrepancies in the metadata of the emails submitted by the defense. These alterations cast serious doubt on the authenticity of their evidence." Emma stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt by Mercer to discredit the truth. The emails were provided directly by our whistleblower, Rachel Simmons, and we stand by their authenticity." The judge raised a hand. "Ms. Hargrove, do you have evidence to support your claim?" Victoria handed a file to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As he reviewed the documents, the room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. A shocking turn. The judge finally looked up. "Ms. Hayes, you'll have the opportunity to refute these claims, but I must admit, the evidence presented by the plaintiff raises questions." Emma's jaw tightened. "Thank you, Your Honor. We request time to review this so-called forensic analysis and call our own expert to verify its validity." The judge nodded. "Granted. Court is adjourned until tomorrow." As the courtroom emptied, Michael felt the weight of despair settle over him. "They're trying to turn the tables," he said to Emma as they walked out. "If they discredit the emails, everything falls apart." Emma put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They're grasping at straws, Michael. They know they're losing, and this is their Hail Mary. We'll fight back." Uncovering the truth. Back at their office, the team pored over the forensic report Mercer had submitted. Joe, the investigator, had already called in a favor from a trusted expert, a cybersecurity analyst named Elena Torres. She arrived that evening, laptop in hand, ready to dive into the data. "This looks like a classic case of manipulation," Elena said after an hour of analysis. "Mercer likely altered their own copies of these emails to make it appear as though they've been tampered with. It's a tactic I've seen before in cases involving powerful corporations." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Can you prove it?" Elena grinned. "Not only can I prove it, but I can also show the original, unaltered metadata from Rachel's submissions. Mercer didn't count on us having a backup." The team breathed a collective sigh of relief. But Emma knew this victory wouldn't come without a cost. "Elena, we'll need you to testify tomorrow. Are you up for it?" "Absolutely," Elena replied. "Let's take these guys down." A dangerous warning. That night, Michael returned to the shelter only to find chaos. A fire alarm blared, and residents were gathered outside, shivering in the cold. Michael ran to Margie, the shelter director, who was trying to calm the crowd. "What happened?" Michael asked, his voice urgent. Margie shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and fear. "Someone set fire to the storage room. We were lucky it didn't spread further." Michael's stomach churned. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. "This is Mercer," he muttered under his breath. Margie grabbed his arm. "Michael, they're targeting you. You need to be careful." Michael nodded, his resolve hardening. "They're trying to scare me, but I'm not walking away." Turning the tide. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than usual, the tension thicker than ever. Mercer's team looked confident, but Emma and Elena were ready. Elena took the stand, her demeanor calm and professional. Emma guided her through her testimony, ensuring the jury understood the technical details of her analysis. Using a series of visuals, Elena demonstrated how Mercer had manipulated the metadata in their copies of the emails. "The original metadata," Elena explained, pointing to the screen, "matches perfectly with the timestamps and server information from Rachel Simmons's submissions. Mercer's so-called discrepancies are a fabrication." Victoria Hargrove objected multiple times, but each objection was overruled. By the time Elena finished, Mercer's lawyers looked visibly shaken. Emma turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we've shown that Mercer Development's accusations are not only false, but an attempt to derail this case. We respectfully request sanctions against the plaintiff for submitting falsified evidence." The judge nodded gravely. "I'll take it under advisement." The final blow. With the email controversy resolved, Emma delivered one final blow. "Your Honor, we've uncovered direct payments from Mercer Development to county official Edward Grayson. These payments coincide with the expedited auctions of properties owned by vulnerable individuals, including Mr. Carter." She handed the evidence to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The courtroom buzzed as Emma laid out the pattern of corruption, connecting Mercer's actions to a broader scheme of exploitation. When Emma finished, the judge turned to Victoria Hargrove. "Ms. Hargrove, do you have a response?" Victoria stood, her confidence clearly shaken. "Your Honor, the defense's claims are circumstantial at best. Mercer Development operates within the bounds of the law." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Circumstantial or not, the evidence warrants further investigation. This court will issue a formal inquiry into Mercer Development's practices." A glimmer of hope. As the session ended, Michael stepped outside the courthouse to cheers from the gathered crowd. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. David clapped Michael on the back. "You did it, Mike. You stood your ground." Michael shook his head. "We're not done yet, but we're closer." Emma joined them, her face finally showing signs of relief. The judge is taking this seriously. Mercer's empire is starting to crack. Michael looked out at the crowd, their signs and chants filling the air with hope. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of possibility. A chance not just to reclaim his land, but to stand up for everyone who'd been pushed aside. Justice for all. The courtroom was silent as the judge re-entered, his robe billowing with a sense of finality. The air was thick with anticipation. This was the final day of the trial that had captured the attention of an entire nation. Michael Carter sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the judge. Beside him, Emma Hayes shuffled through her notes, ready to make their closing arguments. Mercer Development's once confident legal team sat with stiff expressions, their polished personas beginning to crack. They had weathered the storm of evidence, but the weight of their corruption was becoming too heavy to ignore. The final argument. Emma stood and addressed the jury, her voice calm but resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not just about Michael Carter. It's about every vulnerable person who has been preyed upon by those in power. Mercer Development systematically exploited loopholes, bribed officials, and manipulated the legal system to take what didn't belong to them. Mr. Carter's land is just one example, but it's a powerful one." She gestured toward Michael. "This man served his country, sacrificed his youth, and then fought to rebuild his life after losing everything. But instead of compassion, he was met with greed and exploitation. Mercer Development saw him as an easy target, someone they thought couldn't fight back. They were wrong." Emma paused, letting her words sink in. "The evidence we've presented, emails, financial records, and testimony, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mercer didn't just bend the law. They broke it. I ask you to stand with Michael Carter and send a message that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." She sat down, and the room erupted into murmurs. Even the judge seemed moved as he nodded toward Victoria Hargrove, Mercer's lead attorney, to make her closing argument. Victoria rose, her demeanor cold and calculated. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the defense has painted a picture of Mercer Development as a villainous corporation. But the truth is much simpler. Mercer followed the law. The property in question was legally auctioned after Mr. Carter failed to pay taxes for years. That's the system we live in, and it works to maintain fairness." Her voice sharpened. "The defense wants you to believe that Mercer is guilty of corruption, but the evidence they've presented is circumstantial and unreliable. Don't let emotional appeals cloud your judgment. This is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics." Victoria sat, her confidence intact, though the tension in the room suggested she knew the case wasn't going her way. The verdict. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Michael's heart pounded as he watched them file in. The foreman stood, holding a slip of paper that would determine his fate. The judge spoke, his voice steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded. "We have, Your Honor." Michael gripped the edge of the table as the foreman read. "On the charge of trespassing, we find the defendant, Michael Carter, not guilty. On the matter of the property auction and ownership, we find in favor of the defendant, Michael Carter." The room erupted in cheers. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment as supporters hugged one another. Michael slumped in his chair, the weight of years of struggle finally lifting. Emma squeezed his shoulder, her eyes glistening with tears. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Further, this court orders an immediate investigation into Mercer Development's business practices and their dealings with county officials. This is a victory for justice, but it is only the beginning. Mercer's downfall. In the days following the verdict, the fallout for Mercer Development was swift and unforgiving. The court-ordered investigation uncovered a web of corruption spanning years. County officials resigned in disgrace, and several Mercer executives faced criminal charges. Rachel Simmons, the whistleblower, became a hero in the public eye. Despite the threats she faced, she continued to advocate for ethical business practices and worked with activists to push for reform in property laws. Mercer Development CEO released a statement claiming ignorance of the corruption, but it did little to stem the tide of public outrage. The company's stock plummeted, and they faced lawsuits from former property owners who had been similarly exploited. A new beginning. With the case behind him, Michael returned to his land. Standing beneath the old oak tree, he felt a wave of emotion. The land, once a symbol of loss, was now a testament to resilience and justice. The community rallied around him, helping to clear the construction debris and begin rebuilding. David, Michael's longtime friend, brought a group of veterans to assist. "You're not doing this alone," David said, handing Michael a hammer. "This is our fight too." Michael smiled, a rare moment of peace softening his features. Together, they began constructing the sanctuary he had dreamed of years ago. A place not just for him, but for others who needed a fresh start. A legacy of hope. Months later, the land was transformed into a community center and shelter for veterans and the homeless. It was named Carter's Haven, a tribute to Michael's perseverance and the collective effort of everyone who had stood by him. At the grand opening, Emma gave a speech. "This isn't just a building. It's a reminder that when we stand together, we can overcome even the most powerful adversaries." Michael's fight was for more than just land. It was for dignity, justice, and hope. Michael stood beside her, humbled by the crowd that had gathered. Rachel was there too, her smile wide as she handed him a plaque inscribed with the words, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." As the sun set over the oak tree, Michael took a deep breath. The road had been long and painful, but he had reclaimed more than just his land. He had found purpose, a community, and a legacy that would outlast him. Epilogue. In the years that followed, Carter's Haven became a beacon of hope. Michael often sat under the oak tree, watching children play and veterans share stories. He knew his fight had been worth it, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after. And as he looked out at the life bustling around him, he felt a sense of peace. His journey had been one of loss, struggle, and redemption. And through it all, he had learned one unshakable truth: even the smallest voice can bring down a giant.